Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of Trait Talking. And today's particularly exciting because we're not joined by just one but two members of the Fitness Genes science team. So today's episode is going to be looking at our latest report release, which is iron deficiency anemia in women. So it's a report that we've added into the women's health category, and has been built off feedback that we received from our audience. When we put out Women's Health at the end of last year, one of the questions we had back was around women training around menstrual cycle. So we've gone away, done some research, and developed today's report. So today I'm joined for the second time by Dr. Haran. Haran, welcome back.
Hi, glad to be back.
And also for the first time, Dr. Olatz. Dr. Olatz, welcome to Trait Talking.
Hello, everyone.
So Olatz, for people who are not familiar with yourself and what you do here at Fitness Genes, would you mind just giving a bit of an introduction?
My name is Olatz. I'm the bioinformatician slash computational biology in Fitness Genes. And my background is in genetic epidemiology and twin studies. And also I'm very interested in this trait because I used to be an athlete. Particularly, I did track and field in 400 meters with hurdles in the Spanish team.
So international athlete, very much sort of...
Yes, international. I have like the outfit. Yeah, it's official. Yeah.
So myself and Haran just recreational, but today we're joined by a legitimate international athlete, so you can really put us in our place.
I mean, now I only do tag rugby, but it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, and tag rugby star, excellent.
Exactly.
So today's report and today's conversation is around iron deficiency anemia in women. So I want to just start right at the very top and just get a bit more of an understanding of what iron is and why we need it.
Sure. So iron is essentially a mineral that we need, and we need it in particular to produce red blood cells. So red blood cells are the component of our blood, the kind of biconcave disc-shaped cells that transport oxygen around the body. Now, in particular, they have a kind of pigment or protein called hemoglobin, and that transports oxygen around the body. So about 60-70% of our iron is actually as hemoglobin. So we need iron to produce red blood cells and specifically hemoglobin. There's another related protein which transports oxygen and uses oxygen for muscles, that kind of supplies oxygen to muscles. That's called myoglobin. So actually, if you cut open meat and it appears red, that's due to myoglobin in there. So about 15% of our body's iron is as myoglobin. And then iron has lots of other kind of roles in terms of enzyme reactions, producing hormones, etc. And actually lots of our cells have internal stores of iron. So about 25% of our iron is kind of in these internal stores.
Okay, so that relationship between iron and red blood cell production, so obviously that starts to point towards a key relationship for athletes and endurance athletes in particular as well.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right, so how much iron do we actually need in our diets or per day?
Well, actually, there's a difference between men and women. Men are expected to eat around 8 milligrams per day, whereas women, we are required to have around 14 milligrams. So we're talking about almost like double amount. And also even during like pregnancy and breastfeeding, we might actually need more because, for instance, like iron, if you choose to breastfeed when you have kids, the iron is transmitted through the milk. But there are different reasons why we require like we need more iron than men. Mainly it's because, of course, women have a menstruation and we lose about 30 to 40 milliliters per month, which if you think about it, like 30 to 40 milliliters it's not that bad, not that big if we look at like the typical like 100 milliliter spot that you use when you're traveling. But we have 4 to 5 liters of blood. So we lose around 1% of blood per month. And also following childbirth, we lose a lot of blood as well. But also there are other reasons why we might need higher iron requirements. And one of the reasons is because we might have higher risk of gastrointestinal disorders, such as celiac disease and Crohn's disease. So once we take iron, we need to absorb it. So that absorption might not happen and therefore not acquire it. And also one of the reasons that is more like social reasons, and especially in athletes, that for instance, when I was doing athletics, I was required to try to be as lean as possible. So we actually had, like, I was on a calorie deficit diet and a very restrictive eating pattern. So actually, since we eat less, we might require, like, proportionally, we might actually eat less iron. So that's why we are encouraged to take more iron compared to men as well.
Okay, so women have a higher iron requirement than men, and it sounds as though women who are also training at high intensities also have an increased requirement as well. Are there any other kind of lifestyle variables that we need to look at when identifying an individual's kind of individual iron requirements?
Well, also vegetarian and vegan diet, since meat is a source of iron. Vegetarian and vegan diets as well are very important to have a look at that. Okay.
And so Haran, I think sort of, a lot of our customers are obviously very focused on their fitness and their health and exercising regularly. So I think I want to sort of unpack that relationship between iron and exercise slightly more and look at how exercise and exercise frequencies and intensities perhaps sort of shapes the iron requirements of an individual, especially someone who is training quite frequently.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So actually, if you look at the evidence base, kind of endurance activity and high intensity activities, those kind of activities in particular, can actually kind of deplete your iron levels and increase your risk of iron deficiency, at least in the short term. And if you don't have adequate recovery and you're continually training at high intensity, then there is a increased risk of low iron levels. In terms of what's actually causing that, what is it about exercise that causes that? There's several possible reasons. So like you said, when you exercise heavily, you kind of adapt. So your body makes lots of adaptations. So for instance, in endurance runners or endurance athletes, one adaptation is they produce more red blood cells. That's called a polycythemic response. So obviously, if they're producing more red blood cells and making lots of other adaptations, their body has increased iron requirements. Now, if they're not taking in enough iron for some of the reasons that Olatz alluded to, then that increases their risk of iron deficiency. So there's that. So there's a kind of imbalance between your intake and your increased requirements. But there's also exercise, at least in the acute setting, can kind of interfere with your absorption of iron. So iron, when you eat it, it's absorbed in the gut. And when you sort of kind of heavily exercise, that causes lots of inflammatory changes and hormonal changes, which might interfere with the absorption of iron in your gut. And a kind of big cause of iron deficiency is essentially blood loss. So obviously we've talked about women, and that's due to menstrual blood loss, as Olatz has mentioned. However, in endurance athletes, there's possibly some other kind of slightly minor forms of blood loss. So for instance, in marathon runners, there's something called foot strike hemolysis. So the kind of mechanical trauma of your feet hitting the ground causes a destruction of red blood cells, and then that can lead to a loss of iron. Also, your bladder, that kind of posterior wall, so the wall behind, that can actually get trauma through long-term endurance events. And then that can cause a loss of blood through the urine. So that can cause also iron loss. And then finally, there's kind of iron loss through sweat. So for all those kind of reasons, impaired absorption, increased blood loss, and then the imbalance between your intake and your iron demands, for those reasons, people who heavily exercise or do lots of endurance exercise are more at risk of iron deficiency anemia. And that risk is kind of compounded in women, especially if they're losing blood through their menstrual cycle as well.
So is the solution to that just looking at iron intake? So you've got the increased requirement, reduced absorption, the other reasons that you listed. So would that be then looking at that recommended iron intake? I think, like you said, 8 milligrams for men, 14 for women, and actually increasing that based on those circumstances, the fact that they are exercising at those higher intensities and at that higher frequency as well.
Well, there's also genetics involved in it.
Okay, well, yeah, and actually, let's move on to that because obviously we've looked at those lifestyle variables, but this is a report produced by Fitness Genes, so there's obviously a genetic influence here, as I understand it. So what is the relationship between genetics and iron deficiency anemia or an individual's iron levels?
Yeah, so myself and I looked at a paper, and they looked at something which is called transferrin levels. So let me just explain a bit about transferrin. So basically, there's lots of different markers of your body's iron status. And one of those is transferrin. So what that is a protein that transports iron in the body. Now, when you have low iron levels, your kind of liver compensates by producing much more of this transport protein. So your transferrin levels are higher when you've got lower iron in your body. And the other thing is that they're kind of less saturated because there's not enough iron. So lots of the transferrin is not actually bound to iron. So there's something, if you have a blood test, what you find is something you call your transferrin saturation would be lower, but your transferrin levels would be higher. So myself and others looked at a study where they looked at the transferrin gene, and they looked at two variants of that transferrin gene, and they found that one variant, a kind of risk variant, increases the risk of iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia in premenopausal women. So people who carry that variant are at a higher risk. However, that can be compensated by another protective transferrin variant, which kind of reduces your risk. So they looked at those two variants, and then they looked at another gene, which is called your HFE gene or your hemochromatosis gene. Now, hemochromatosis is a kind of condition which is kind of like the opposite of iron deficiency anemia. So it's a condition where your body stores too much iron, or kind of iron overload. Now, there's kind of lots of different mutations, but there's two sort of prevalent mutations in especially European populations. Now, if you carry two copies of those mutations, then you kind of have hemochromatosis and you're at risk of abnormally high iron levels. But if you carry just one copy, your normal health is fine, and you might have slightly higher iron levels, but it's not pathologically high, and you're not going to have any health abnormalities. So actually carrying one copy of those hemochromatosis mutations is also protective against iron deficiency anemia in women, and that's what they found in that study as well. So basically, there's two transferrin gene variants that affect your iron level, and also the hemochromatosis variants. And the combination of those together will determine your risk of iron deficiency anemia.
Okay, so we're looking at two genes and then also two variants within those two genes. So that gives us actually quite a good amount of data to look at and actually categorize people based on their individual risk, whether they carry kind of this increased risk one, as you mentioned, or this protective one within the transferrin gene. So Olatz, your role here at Finish is obviously sort of like then taking that data and actually translating it into something useful and structured that we can deliver as a report. So how did we then use that data to create the categories that we'll place members into and deliver our insights and recommendations through?
So as you mentioned, we looked into the risk variants that increase the risk and the protective variants that decrease that risk of iron deficiency anemia. And then we calculated the overall risk depending on the combination of those genes. And we classified people onto three groups: an elevated risk, moderately higher risk, and higher risk. So it will depend on your genetic combination, which group you are going to be in. Okay,
so we've got three groups that we put members between, depending on if they carry risk variants or protective variants across those two genes or those total of four variants. So we've got, did you say unelevated, moderately higher risk, and higher risk as the three bands?
Yeah, and we have around 70% of 65 to 70% of people on unelevated, then around 20 to 25% in moderately higher, and 5% in higher.
Okay, so that's the distribution across those bands. Mm-hmm. So I assume sort of those people that unelevated, there's not that genetic risk of having lower iron levels as a result of their gene variants, but they may need to look at kind of those lifestyle variables as we've kind of discussed in terms of around training and that type of thing. So for those people where they have that moderately higher or higher risk, and those genetic factors that may influence lower iron levels, what are the particular types of things that we've recommended that they do in order to mitigate that risk?
So we might have three different actions, main actions that we have been touched upon. So first of all, of course, the iron intake. We start with taking iron. So we have two groups of foods to target that are high in iron. We have heme iron, which is spelled HAEM, heme iron, which is the one that is contained in meat and seafood, beef, sardines, liver, oysters, and also non-heme iron, which is tofu, soybeans, pistachios, and legumes such as lentils, etc.
So you've got like almost like a carnivore version and a vegan version in terms of your options for iron intake. Is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, so the heme iron, which is more like the bloody one, I would say, is easily absorbed compared to the non-heme iron. Yeah.
Okay, so actually, in terms of actually getting iron into your body and in use, is that sort of a preferred method going through that heme food groups?
Yeah, I mean, if it's easily absorbed, like heme iron would be better than non-heme iron. But equally, if you're vegetarian or vegan, like you can actually, maybe go for the non-heme iron. And but also what is very important to take into account is like how the heme iron and non-heme iron are absorbed, because there are some interactions. Also, for instance, vitamin C is shown to enhance iron absorption. So, for instance, if you like salad or tofu or some like type of meat, you can do it like with like orange with the meat or like a squeeze of lemon, which actually enhances like the absorption. Okay. The problem is that there are some other foods that impair the absorption of iron when you take iron with them. So for instance, coffee, tea, and red wine, they contain plant polyphenols, which actually they bond to the non-heme iron. So for instance, like tofu, soybeans, pistachios, etc. And that's a problem because they actually bond to the iron, and then the iron cannot be absorbed.
Okay, so if you're having something like red meat paired with wine, then actually the iron with that red meat, it'd be absorbed at a lower rate because of that red wine?
Okay, so the meat is heme iron, so that would not be a problem. Okay. But the non-heme iron, that would be a problem. So for instance, if you are eating, I don't know, like coffee, with like soybean, tofu, whatever, and you think you're getting the protein, you might not absorb that for breakfast.
Just your usual tofu breakfast. Yeah.
So have for breakfast wine and a beef. That would be okay.
Just start the day off with a glass of wine and some red meat and your intake.
Yeah, but then we have the coffee, tea, and red wine, which has to do with non-heme iron, so they are not friends. But dairy is not friends with either non-heme or heme, or heme iron. So the problem is like dairy has calcium, which actually competes with iron because the absorption pathways are very similar. So actually it would bond into that, and then the iron will not be absorbed. And actually, in some religions, they don't eat like meat with dairy, just to mention. So dairy, don't mix dairy with either non-heme iron or iron. That doesn't mean like stop like drinking dairy. It's just more like, well, maybe first have your glass of milk and then eat your sandwich with whatever you have inside.
Okay. So just to sort of take it back to the top a little bit. So we're looking at ensuring that people are getting adequate amounts of iron in their diet. So 8 milligrams for men and 14 milligrams for women, looking at kind of those lifestyle variables that may be increasing their iron requirements, especially around exercise. So the recommendation would be to look at food sources rich in iron, which we have heme and non-heme. And for the non-heme, pairing it with so polyphenols can reduce absorption, but then pairing both those sources of iron with you said calcium.
Non-pairing them with calcium, but pairing them with vitamin C. So
but actually using vitamin C to improve
exactly
that
like orange juice.
Okay, this is really interesting. So Haran, if someone sort of finds that they have these risk variants associated with lower iron levels, and they feel like they're someone who's also training a lot, so those lifestyle variables are a concern. How can they find out their sort of absolute iron levels at any sort of moment in time?
Yeah, so our trade is essentially based on gene variants only, so it's a kind of prediction. But actually, the best way is to have a direct assay, so basically to have a blood test. And there's lots of different markers of iron status. So I guess your GP or health professional will talk through it. However, one thing I just do want to mention is basically, like I said, iron is used to make red blood cells. So uh, what we call iron deficiency anemia is when hemoglobin on the blood test, your hemoglobin level will be low, so lower than average. Um, However, in athletes, particularly women athletes, that they're also at risk of having what's called iron deficiency non-anemia. So their iron levels are low. So lots of other markers of iron, such as ferritin, which is your iron stores, and their transferrin will be higher, but their ferritin will be lower. Those kind of derangements you'll see on their blood test, but their hemoglobin will be normal. Um, so that's something to check. So basically, you should try and get your iron levels checked. I think actually something else to add on that is that the kind of symptoms of iron deficiency anemia are kind of non-specific. So you might just feel kind of fatigue or less energy than normal. You might get slightly breathless, or you might have reduced exercise tolerance. So, for instance, you might find you're less likely to run at the pace that you normally run your 5K at, or something like that. So, it's kind of non-specific symptoms. It isn't very obvious that it would be really obvious that no, I've got low iron levels. So that's another reason to get a blood test.
Okay, so those are quite sort of like immediate sort of symptoms of low iron levels, and we're very much looking at this from a sort of exercise performance point of view. But is there actually sort of like any particular health risks to long-term iron, low iron levels, or even iron deficiency?
Yeah, so in the long term, there's lots of things. So iron is used to kind of boost your immune system, etc. So actually, people who have kind of chronic iron deficiency in the long term essentially are at greater risk of certain illnesses and infections. It can also have adverse effects in your heart. So certain heart rate abnormalities are more likely to be seen after kind of long-standing iron deficiency. And then particularly sort of germane to women is iron deficiency anemia increases your risk of kind of complications around childbirth and pregnancy. So those are kind of three key long-term health risks of long-standing iron deficiency.
Okay, great. So I think from this report, what we've kind of learned, or especially what I've learned, I assume you guys already knew. So women have a higher iron requirement than men in general. Also, sort of, and maybe sort of should make this point, but it's especially people who are premenopausal who are exercising at a higher frequency and at a higher intensity or more regular frequency that actually have an increased risk of low iron levels. But there's also other lifestyle variables such as like dietary preference. So people who are vegan and vegetarian, for example, might be at increased risk of iron. And the main strategy to kind of address this, if we find through a blood test that you do have low iron levels, is looking at your nutritional intake. So looking at your heme and non-heme sort of intakes of iron, and looking at use of vitamin C to help absorption, but also making sure you're not reducing that absorption through things like calcium and polyphenols as well.
Correct.
There you go. Great. Excellent. I can maybe start writing the email that's going to go out to all members. I feel like I'm starting to get a firmer grasp on this subject. So it's been particularly useful just for me personally. Is there anything else that you feel like you've sort of seen in researching this report that you thought was particularly interesting, or anything you feel like we haven't mentioned that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I'd just like to mention that it's
one at a time.
Okay, sorry. Men first.
And for that, we're going to let Olatz go first.
Thank you. No, it was about how to adapt your exercise to your menstrual period. I think there has been a lot of talk surrounding that. Realistically, in the ideal world, we would like to rest during period days, but it's almost not possible. And also,
especially if you're following a structured program or there's structured competition days and that type of thing that you're used to.
Exactly. But also, for instance, instead of maybe waiting until you have your period to I have my period, I want to eat steak, I would maybe have the iron before, leading to the period. So then you're you have plenty of iron before you lose it. So then you don't feel a slower. That's a personal thing that I did. But
preloading on iron to anticipate that sort of drop in iron levels.
Exactly.
And actually, just just a question has come to mind just when you were talking there. So how useful could this report be in determining when people should be exercising? Is this something that we could deliver and say this is going to be your optimal time for following certain types of exercise during your menstrual cycle, or are there other variables that we need to look at for that?
I think that if you have like a very regular period, it could be something that maybe you could look into. The thing is, for instance, when I was doing like high competition, whatever, like most people didn't, we all lost our periods at some point. I mean, not lost where it is, like you just have irregular periods, so it was even like more difficult to actually know where you're going to have your period and like work around this. And also the goal is maybe like a marathon or another competition, so it's not your priority. But equally, I think everyone is different. Not to sound too basic, but listen to your body, and if it's possible, yeah, but I don't know, give it a try, maybe. But listen to your body.
Okay, so there's further kind of individual aspects that sort of go into when people should be training and recovering beyond just this as a very sort of it's a non-diagnostic report. It's looking at gene variants. So using this as a single source is probably not particularly useful. Haran, any other sort of concluding remarks?
So just two things I wanted to quickly mention. So yes, we're focused on premenopausal women. However, I think Olatz alluded to people who are pregnant also have higher iron requirements, and people who are breastfeeding also have higher iron requirements. So it's not just if you're having a menstrual cycle. Those particular women in particular will have high iron requirements. And then also if there's any adolescents, basically during adolescence, you're kind of growing sort of more, so your iron requirements are higher. So those people will probably need slightly more iron in your diet as well. We talked about diet. The other thing is that iron supplements can be prescribed by a doctor to increase your iron levels. So our advice basically is to if you're considering iron supplements, is to go and get your blood levels checked with a doctor first, and then they could prescribe iron supplements, because iron supplements, well, the dosage that they prescribe has to be kind of titrated to your body's current iron levels, and then they kind of have side effects. So there needs to be a kind of cost benefit calculation kind of in there kind of thing to get the benefits of iron supplements. But that's something that some women may want to consider on top of the dietary measures that Olatz has already mentioned.
Okay, so find out your genetic risk for your fitness genes, find out your absolute iron levels by going and get your bloods checked, and follow your recommended strategies and actions from fitness genes to make sure you're optimizing your iron levels and aiding your exercise performance through that.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Good summary.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Olatz, thank you very much for joining us for the first time. Will you be back?
Yes.
Okay, look forward to it. And Dr. Haran, a pleasure as always. Look forward to speaking with you again soon as well.
Cool, thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Bye, Alex.